Good morning. About 12 years ago, after these high holy days, after the festivals, and just before a certain more pagan-based celebration in late October, my husband and I were going out for the evening. There was a large orange pumpkin sitting on our kitchen table, and my husband asked our two younger children, Noah and Leah, to carve it. That was traditionally a family affair, but we couldn't be there that night. Generally, they did sort of the common face that you see, 2 eyes, a nose, and a smiling mouth with missing teeth. There were always mild disagreements, but we figured they'd handle it. We left, and we returned many hours later after dark. We came through the back door, right into the kitchen, and the pumpkin was gone, and remarkably, the table was spotless. So I asked our kids where it was, where was the pumpkin? They instructed us to go outside and approach the house from the front. As my husband and I walked up our front path toward the porch, we saw the pumpkin fully alit and carved, like this. Not the usual face, not anything seasonal. They had carved Beth-Am into the pumpkin. Later that night, our older daughter, Rachel Sarenka, told me that on family outings, the 3 kids played a little game. They would take bets as to how long it would take my husband or me to mention Beth-Am. Looking at the pumpkin, we laughed, and then we laughed a little harder thinking about our neighbors, wondering what they would think. Who is this Beth, and why did she merit a pumpkin? We were pretty sure they didn't know what Beth-Am was. After all, Homeland, Maryland is not exactly the shtetl. But clearly, Beth-Am had become a big topic in our family. I thought about it then, and I've thought about it several times on my path to this job. Generally, a synagogue president on the high holy days gives a sort of state of the union, sort of a state of the synagogue, how's it doing? I'd like to start by taking a step back and not talking so much about how we're doing, but why we matter. Why do synagogues matter, and why in particular does Beth-Am matter? Well, I really can't talk about why Beth-Am matters without talking at the threshold about why Judaism matters. I'm not a rabbi, my reasons are personal, and I have a few. I hope some of them will resonate with you, and maybe you'll think of some of your own. First, I like Judaism because it seems like a pretty good religion. When I was dating my husband Cy, before we were married, he was then, as he often says, playing for the other team. He had not yet converted. And even then, he always called Judaism the thinking person's religion. Actually, he called it the thinking man's religion, but I wanted to make him sound a little more current. At the outset, I like the idea that there's no original sin. I love the idea that the definition of God, and frankly, even the existence of God, is open. Some people have a personal God. I subscribe to the Reconstructionalist view of God, and many, even here, believe in no God at all. I remember during a class I took post-Melton a few years ago, we learned about conversion. In Christianity, to convert, if you're doing it by the book, so to speak, you need to accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. To convert to Judaism, you must accept the mitzvot, the deeds. In other words, you can pass go in Judaism without expressing a belief in God. This emphasis on deeds and actions over a prescribed belief was really appealing to me. I also have a sense of belonging in Judaism. Last year, a friend and soon-to-be fellow synagogue president, Bob Halleck, talked about why he cared about Judaism in synagogues. Excuse me. He said that growing up in Hibbing, Minnesota, as one of a very few number of Jews, he felt like an outsider. He felt different. Of course, there was this guy, Robert Zimmerman, later to be called Bob Dylan, but still, there weren't many. And Bob felt odd, like a stranger sometimes. He said that even though his family was neither religious nor very observant, he just felt at home in the synagogue, in his family's synagogue. I could really relate to that. Growing up, I always felt different and a little odd. I don't want to overstate this. I was a white kid in a society or country where it's a lot easier to be white than to be a person of color. But still, I did feel odd and different, sometimes uncomfortably so. and I really wanted to fit in. I remember the night before first grade, my mom took me shopping, and she let me pick out my own first lunchbox. I was so excited, I picked out this shiny lavender container with a picture of the model Twiggy on it. I wanted to be that all-American girl, never mind that she was British. But I never felt like that. I always felt a little odd, a little different. We celebrated different holidays, we ate different foods, we never had a Christmas tree in our window, and sometimes, in even the most rudimentary financial transactions on the playground, I would hear people say things like, "Don't try and Jew me down." But like my friend Bob Halleck, I always felt comfortable and at home in our family synagogue. Ironically, as I grew up, I came to embrace this feeling of difference. Judaism reminded me of my difference all the time. Jews have been strangers and outsiders. At Justice Ginsburg's memorial service, Rabbi Lauren Holzblatt from Washington, D.C., talked about the 36 times it appears in the Bible that Jews have a duty to welcome the stranger. My parents reinforced this over and over when I was growing up, that as Jews, we have a unique obligation to welcome the stranger because we were strangers too. And finally, I feel strongly that my practicing Judaism is essential because it honors all the Jews who were murdered simply because they were Jews. Perhaps this is a little bit in my DNA. My father emigrated from Poland to Palestine in 1931 when he was just 2 years old. His parents left behind a comfortable life because they felt they would never be accepted by the Poles, and they believed that anti-Semitism, which they experienced constantly, would never end. By the time my dad was 16, a time when some 16-year-olds today might be sneaking out at night to parties, he was sneaking out to the port of Haifa in the middle of the night to help smuggle Jewish European refugees onto the land so that they could escape death in the Holocaust. By practicing Judaism when others died simply because they were Jewish, we make sure that their lives were not in vain. One of Rabbi Berg's first sermons here at Beth Am over a decade ago left a very deep impression on me. At his installation, he talked about why he wanted to be a pulpit rabbi. He talked about synagogues as unique institutions. He said they were different and unique and special because they were there to support you from cradle to grave, from infancy to death. I thought about that then. One of the first things we did after we became members at Beth Am was named our baby daughter Rachel Serenka on this bima. We celebrated 3 of our children's B'nai Mitzvot here, my father's 90th birthday. We've been here for weddings, a few funerals, and we sat Shiva with countless congregants. So clearly, I belonged to a synagogue no matter what. If I didn't live in Baltimore, I belonged to a synagogue wherever I lived. If I lived in Baltimore and there were no Beth Am, hard to imagine, I would belong to another synagogue in Baltimore. But we chose Beth Am in particular. When we arrived in Baltimore in our late 20s, I immediately began shul shopping. My husband, like me, was drawn to this gorgeous building. We were also drawn to a congregation that wanted to preserve this historic building, and that's continued, even as we've added stunning renovations to this building, and even as we embark on an office building next door that will be aesthetically compatible and meet our growing needs. We were drawn to a congregation that was committed to Baltimore City. We loved the sense of tradition, combined with a sense of progressive thinking and a duty and sense of responsibility to our community here in Reservoir Hill, not some abstract community. And so here we are. And traditions and rituals are more meaningful here at Beth Am together with you. It is really wonderful to see so many people whom I haven't seen in over a year and a half because of COVID. And while I miss many people who are not here, even knowing you're out in streaming land reinforces that sense of community. And with our synagogue, with this community, we do welcome the stranger. I've joined several congregants in the past few years at protests against immigration bans, deportations, and ICE policies in nearby Howard County. And we engage with our neighbors, seeking to become partners and hopefully even friends rather than strangers. And we also seek to welcome the Jewish stranger in our midst. Last year, before Rosh Hashanah, because we were not going to be together, we decided to deliver tote bags or give out tote bags that said Beth Am with apples and honey and a few other items. I myself delivered over 30 tote bags in one day. I covered a lot of neighborhoods and a lot of terrain throughout Baltimore. One stop was particularly memorable, and the person there said I could share it today. When I got to this house, a young boy was playing outside. I introduced myself and showed him the tote bag, and he seemed pretty excited with it. His mother, who was inside, came out, and she thanked me for the tote bag, and then she thanked us. She thanked Beth Am for welcoming her as part of the Beth Am family, even though she couldn't afford full dues and very little. She said without Beth Am, she would not be able to raise her son as part of a Jewish community. It was right there, right then, where it occurred to me, I think for the first time in a concrete way, that Beth Am was not just about my Judaism and my family's Judaism. By welcoming the stranger, our Beth Am is about the perpetuation of Judaism. And it's through synagogue life that we honor Jews who were murdered simply because they were Jews. It's how we announce to the world, we are still here. Over 15 years ago, I'm not sure of the exact date, our fellow congregant, Ambassador Alfred Moses, gave a talk right here from this bima on Yom Kippur. He lamented that too many Jews focus solely on the Holocaust, and he admonished that leaning on the Holocaust and our victimhood and a sense of guilt was not sufficient to carry Judaism forward. I was sitting right back in the second to last row on this side of the sanctuary, and I raised my hand to make a comment, something that was rare for me. I told Ambassador Moses that I think about the Holocaust all the time, and I think about anti-Semitism and persecution of Jews, and I feel it strongly every time a Jew is targeted just because he or she is Jewish. I told him it motivated me and cemented my commitment to Judaism and to pass it on to my children. But I explained exactly how that happened and why. That morning, our youngest daughter, Leah, had chanted Ashrei on this bima again, in this sanctuary. She was such a tiny little peanut that she had to stand on a chair. The usual riser wasn't enough. I was in the congregation, and of course, as a mom, I was feeling so much joy because my adorable little girl was up on the bima. But I even more felt this deep sense of pride in our Jewish survival. Here in the 21st century, after the Holocaust, after everything we've been through throughout history, was a little girl chanting in Hebrew for a congregation celebrating, practicing their Judaism in this beautiful sanctuary. It seemed to me to scream out in the most glorious way, we Jews are still here. And so Ambassador Moses and I found ourselves in vigorous agreement. Jews focus on the Holocaust as victims out of a sense of guilt to the exclusion of everything else is not a recipe to sustain Judaism. But the celebration of Jewish survival throughout history and after the Holocaust is. In October of 2018, my husband Sai and I were lucky enough to travel to Japan on vacation with close friends. There was one Saturday in particular that struck out, that remains memorable. It was a glorious day, the weather was beautiful, and we were in Kyoto, my favorite city there. We spent the entire day walking, looking at shrines, temples, gardens, and museums. We tried delicious and interesting foods, and we didn't return to our hotel until late that night. I remember exactly where I was sitting and exactly where my husband was standing that night in our hotel room. It was just after 10 p.m. in Japan, and so a little after 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time in the United States. I picked up my phone for the first time that day, and I saw a news item. Within that hour, a man had entered the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, gunning down and murdering 11 Jews before he could be stopped. My eyes filled with tears. I couldn't speak. I just handed the phone to my husband. I heard him gasp. We felt sad, but more than anything, we felt hopeless and helpless. We went to bed quietly, and when we woke up, we did what we do. We compartmentalized, and we went on with our vacation. We pressed the pause button on those feelings and processing them. 6 days later, we returned to Baltimore on a Friday. After a long trip by train, plane, and car across multiple time zones, we were pretty tired, and we were a little discombobulated by the time change, 12 hours. So we went to bed that Friday evening, planning to sleep in Saturday morning. We both woke up by 7 a.m. I think we felt like it was dinner time, but we decided to come to Beth Am. I had seen vaguely something about a special service following the Tree of Life shootings the week before. I recall walking into this gorgeous sanctuary that morning and feeling absolutely overwhelmed. The place was filled, the first floor, the sides, the balcony, all around. There were so many Beth Am members and so many others, Jews and non-Jews alike. The sense of mutual support was just indescribable. I remember at the service, participating in the prayers a little bit, of course listening to Rabbi Berg's sermon, but more than anything, looking around at all the people and feeling completely in awe. That Shabbat morning in this synagogue, I no longer felt hopeless and helpless the way I did in that hotel room. I felt there was something that we could do together in the face of hate against Jews, and frankly, in the face of racism and hate against everyone. It felt like our collective presence was the ultimate defiance. I was so proud to be a part of the Beth Am community and to be part of this enormous and unmistakable statement. We will not disappear. We are still here. If my membership at Beth Am for over 30 years had boiled down to that one morning, that one Shabbat service, that one moment, it would have been worthwhile. Dayenu. And so, ensuring the survival of Judaism by embracing traditions and rituals, honoring the stranger, and welcoming the stranger and honoring all Jews who've been murdered simply because they were Jewish, and frankly, all who have been persecuted simply for being different, that is accomplished more effectively in a synagogue as part of a congregational community. When people ask, as they very, very frequently do, why I was crazy enough to become a synagogue president, I generally laugh in agreement. But the truth is, I did it because I cherish Beth Am. And I don't just cherish Beth Am for what it means to me and my family. I cherish it for what it stands for, represents, and accomplishes more broadly. I once heard about a rabbi who, during his High Holy Day sermon, asked his congregation to take their religious observance up a notch. If they never practiced any traditions, he suggested they try lighting Shabbat candles. If they came to the synagogue twice a year for the High Holy Days, he suggested they come for a festival like Sukkot or Shavuot. You get the idea. Well, to repeat, I'm not a rabbi, and your Jewish observance is very personal. But I decided to borrow this rabbi's idea. Actually, I guess I decided to use his idea because I can't really give it back, and tweak it a bit. So I'm asking you, or some of you at least, to consider, in this new year, raising your level of involvement or participation with Beth Am up just a notch. If you've visited Beth Am and attended services but haven't become a member, consider becoming a member and supporting what Beth Am does and is and represents. If you're a member and you've never volunteered, consider volunteering for a discrete project or program, like being a greeter at a service or helping clean up after a program. You'll be hearing more about a committee that we'll probably be calling the One and Done Committee, and we'll be able to do that. If you're a member who's volunteered here sporadically, but never been a member of a committee, consider joining a committee. And if you've been on a committee but never wanted to tackle leadership, consider becoming a chair or co-chair of the committee. If you've never given to the Open Doors Annual Fund, consider making a gift that's meaningful and doable for you. If you've given to the Open Doors Annual Fund, consider raising your gift to a level that's meaningful and doable to you. Consider learning about our strategic plan, and you'll be hearing more about that in the coming weeks, and participating on a committee or task force that's implementing changes at Beth Am to keep us relevant in the coming years. Consider, in this year of 5,782, taking your level of participation and involvement with Beth Am up a little more than it was in 5,781. I promise I will. And together, at the risk of sounding cliche and corny, I assure you that we can make Beth Am stronger now and for the future. When I drafted these comments a few weeks ago and saved them in my Beth Am Finder folder, I hope my kids are listening, I of course needed a name. I thought of a few and ended up calling it HH Draft Speech. Pretty useful. I'd like to conclude by sharing the other titles that occurred to me that morning. Synagogues Matter. Beth Am Matters. We're still here. We will be here. Gamar Chatima Tova. May you be inscribed in the Book of Life.